Okay. Hello, everybody. This is another of our more rambling set talk videos, because the Waking Flame DLC has been announced, and we got a look at all of the new armor sets that will be coming with this dungeon expansion. And there are some good ones. So we have two dungeons here, Red Petal Bastion and the Dread Cellar. These first four sets we're going to be looking at here are from Red Petal Bastion, and these last four are going to be from the Dread Cellar. We're going to start with the Red Petal Bastion sets. And I'm going to be honest, I think that the Red Petal Bastion sets are generally look a little bit more fun and flashy, but I think that Red Petal Bastion might have the weaker of the sets in here. Like, they're cool sets, but I don't know if they're like... But I honestly think that some of the Dread Cellar sets might be meta shakers. I think some of these sets from Dread Cellar might actually change the full-on meta for new stuff. Which, yeah, if that happens, that's going to be huge. With that out of the way, let's get into this. Starting with one of the new monster sets, Prior Theric. This adds 129 weapon and spell damage, and then at 2 items, dealing direct damage with an area of effectability creates a 6-meter shadowy whirlwind below your enemy for 7 seconds. Enemies within said whirlwind take X physical damage every second, and increase their damage taken from your area of effect attacks by 5%. This effect can occur once every 15 seconds. This is interesting for 2 reasons. One is that it increases their damage taken from AoE, which means that this could actually be insanely good for giving stamina groups and possibly even some mage characters a really just good AoE tool. And secondly, it doesn't have this sentence. This set is not, as far as we're aware, scale off the higher of your weapon and spell damage. Which means that this number is probably low, but it is a consistent number. It doesn't change based on your stats. And that's interesting. That's really interesting. Because I got the impression that they didn't want to do flat numbers as much anymore. But Prior Theric appears to be a flat number. Which seems strange to me. But, I don't know. Maybe that's just something that's up to change. Maybe that's what the X means. We don't know what this X means. This is probably just, we don't have exact numbers because this is a PTS set that's been teased, but we haven't gotten the PTS rotation of it out. I do think that this will prove an interesting set, and I think it's worth looking at on stamina builds. I think it might also be worth looking at on some Magicka builds, just because this is really good for getting cleave stuff going. This is probably a really good trash monster set. If you want a trash monster set and aren't planning to run arena weapons for that. Which, I don't know. I don't know what the plan is for those. I don't know most of them. But, Prior Theric, pretty good. Next we have Silver Rose Vigil. This is the heavy armor set from Red Petal Bastion. At 2 items, it's 1,096 max stamina. At 3 items, it is 1,206 maximum health. At 4 items, it is 1096 maximum stamina again, and at 5 items, blocking an attack grants you a stack of Realm Shaper for 15 seconds, granting 1 stack every half second. When you reach 3 stacks, you consume them and launch necrotic energy at your attacker, dealing magicka damage and applying Major Maim for 12 seconds, reducing their damage done by 10%. Once you fire it, you cannot gain additional stacks of Realm Shaper for 20 seconds. Damage scales off your maximum health. So I'm curious. And I don't know if this version of the site lets me do this. Okay, it does not. So this is what... So, bit of a side tangent. This is why we still keep the old sites tabbed. I'm curious what other sources we have for Major Maim. Okay, Banny's Torment, Lady Thorn, and Void Bash. Okay. Okay. I think Banny's comes online earlier than Silver Rose, which makes me think that we want Bonnie's, which makes me think we're going to go for Bonnie's before that, and I don't know if we're still going to be running Lady Thorn, but we'll get to that when we get to these sets from what's the place called? The Dread Cellar. We'll talk about that when we get to Crimson Oath's Rive in Dread Cellar. I do think that Void Bash and Bonnie's are probably both better sources of Major Maim, because Void Bash also gives you a pull, and Bonnie's also gives you Major Vitality, which is a lot better for that sort of like buff and debuff stringing. But this is a cool set, and I think it's pretty decent. I have to wonder if it's worth the dungeon set, or if this is going to be another one of those that we like. Oh great, I got that one instead of the one I actually wanted. Speaking of the one you actually wanted, let's move on to Grizzly Gourmet, because this set is funny. It's not good, I don't think at least, but it's funny. So at 2 items, this gives maximum stamina. At 3 items, it gives weapon and spell damage. At 4 items, it gives offensive penetration. And at 5 items, it gives a stack of maximum stamina. And dealing light attack damage grants you a stack of Baker's Delight for 5 seconds. When you gain 3 stacks, you create a sweet roll next to your target for 5 seconds. If you or an ally touch the sweet roll, both you and the ally gain one of the following. Restore 1,592 health, magicka, and stamina. Grant Empower for 10 seconds, or gain Major Force for 10 seconds. This effect can occur once every 2 seconds. So, let's talk about this for a moment. And we're also going to pull up, for no real reason, a random crafted set in the other tab. We'll get to that in a moment. So this is funny. And this is kind of a cool effect. Because we spawn sweet rolls, and it gives ourselves and one other ally the chance to either get a bunch of resources back, gain Empower, which is a really good damage buff. Empower, for the record, gives you increases the damage of your light and heavy attacks. I want to say by 10%. I think it's considered I think Game Rule considers it a major stuff. I know it comes from... I know we can find it in Mages Guild. I think it's stated how much it is in... Yeah. So, Empower increases the damage of your light and heavy attacks by 40%. Might of the Guild caps that at 3 seconds. The other way that we normally would get that is from a Necromancer morph on Bone Tyrant. And Empowering Grasp. which grants Empower, which gives minor maim, Empower, and enhances the damage of your healing. And that lasts 5. But because Empower is technically considered a major/minor buff, we can extend that to, I want to say, like 7 seconds with Yorvald's Guidance. Because Yorvald's Guidance. But, so this can grant Empower or Major Force. And those are both really good buffs. Especially if you're like in a pub where you don't trust your team. This is a nice thing to throw on where, if absolutely nothing else, you can just grab the sweet roll and get one of these effects. And you can just keep spawning sweet rolls every, 5 seconds or so. Or maybe not even that, to try and give yourself Empower or Major Force, because maybe you don't have a healer that's granting you Empower, that's granting you Major Force, or no one's running Warhorn, because these people are, because pubs, sometimes you get newer players in pubs, sometimes you get players that are fake queued. This would let you get the Major Force buff and the Empower buff on a stamina build, because this is, I will remind you, a medium armor set that is stamina build focused. So this lets you get Empower and Major Force on stamina characters relatively easily. I think that's cool, and I like this set, but it kind of feels like the old crafted set from Morrowind, Daedric Trickery, where when you deal damage, you can apply one of the major buffs to you, Expedition, Protection, Mending, Heroism, or Vitality, at random. It feels like Daedric Trickery's drunken older cousin who got into a Sheogorath cult. You know? And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's cool, and I think it's fun. And the fact that 2 of the 3 are just really good buffs might make this just worth considering for a pub group. I think that's, 2 out of 3 is probably enough to consider it in a pub. And finally, we have Thundercaller. This is the light armor set from Red Petal Bastion. At 2 items, it grants offensive penetration. At 3 and 4 items, it grants a stack of weapon and spell damage. And at 5 items, dealing damage with a fully charged heavy attack calls a bolt of lightning at your target, dealing X shock damage, and leaving a 4-meter lightning crater at the location for 6 seconds, dealing X shock damage per second to enemies touching it. This effect can occur once every 12 seconds and scales up the higher of your weapon and spell damage. Oh boy, this looks familiar. Oh boy, this looks familiar. Yeah, I think this is our Magicka version of Deadlands Assassin. It's a proc damage set on a heavy attack, dealing shock damage initially and leaving a crater at the location for 6 seconds, dealing shock damage per second to enemies touching it, occurring every 12 seconds. So, in a perfect world, you can get a 50% uptime here. I think this is better than Deadlands Assassin. And I think it's awesome, especially on, a sorcerer character who's I control lightning. And you just do this heavy attack, and this bolt of lightning slams down from the sky into your enemies, and leaves the ground crackling with the power of your magics. That's awesome! And I love the look! It's a proc set. Which means it's a proc set that has about a 50% uptime. This is an awesome looking set. And if the animation feels right, it's going to be an awesome thing to play with. I think, but I also think that everything I said about Deadlands about not treating this like a heavy attack set and treating this like, you know, any other proc damage set where you throw in a heavy attack every 12 seconds just for the extra damage from Thundercaller. I think that's the best way to run this. That said, it's a really cool sounding set, and I am definitely going to pick it up just for that reason. Just to throw it on a character at some point, do a heavy attack, and watch lightning fall from the sky upon my enemies, because that sounds like a good rip-roaring time. Alright. And that is all of the Red Petal Bastion sets. Next up, Dread Cellar. Now, these are 3 of the 4 sets from here I think are going to be meta shakers. I think that these are going to change change around a couple of builds, maybe even replace a couple of sets. So, first off, Magma Incarnate. This is our monster set. 1 item adds 129 magicka and stamina recovery. And at 2 items, when you heal yourself or a group member with a single target heal, grants the lowest health group member within 28 meters minor courage and minor resolve, increasing their weapon and spell damage by 215 and armor by 2,974 for 10 seconds. Daedric enemy energy will then bounce to the nearest group member within 8 meters, up to 3 times, applying minor courage and minor resolve for 10 seconds. This effect can occur once every 15 seconds. Okay, that is a bit of a long description. Let's talk about what that means. So when you cast a single target heal ability, which I am going to need to look up what that list is. I know that someone, when the new CPs rolled out, made a frickin' list for this. Okay, so that counts Healing Ward, the Symbiosis skill, the Deep Thoughts skill, Templar's Honor the Dead, Breath of Life, things like Living Trellises, Lotus Blossom, Bursting Vines, Polar Wind, Resistant Flesh, Spirit Guardian, Braided Tether, Dark Conversion, Twilight Matriarch, Funnel Health, Healthy Offering, Siphoning Attacks. Okay, here's the frickin' list. This is a little easier. So everything in this column here will count as single target heals. So, on a healer, that means our Honor the Dead or Breath of Life for, Templars, Bursting Vines, Lotus Blossom, Living Trellises for Warden, Resistant Flesh, Spirit Guardian, and Braided Tether, Dark Conversion and Twilight Matriarch for Sorcerers, Funnel Health, Healthy Offering, and Siphoning Attacks for Nightblade, and Cauterize, I guess, for Dragon Knights. So, this, if you can get this rolling, if you can trigger this consistently, which doesn't feel too bad, casting, because basically we need to cast Breath of Life. Magma Incarnate. We need to cast Breath of Life every 15 seconds on a Templar healer. I don't entirely know how we're doing this on a Warden. Probably work Living Trellises into our rotation somewhere. Or throw on Lotus Blossom as a backbar skill. I keep switching to the wrong one. We're not at U2 yet. We'll get to U2 shortly. Because what that does is it gives us both minor courage and minor resolve. So we'll start with the less impressive of those. Minor resolve is a defense buff, and it's a good defense buff. It's a pretty decent chunk of armor, especially for squishy DPS characters. That's not what we care about here. We care about the fact that this gives us a minor courage source. Right now, our primary source of minor courage is a trial set called Claws of Yulnakren. That comes not from Cloud Rest, from Sunspire. Which is, and this is probably the best tank set in the game. When you taunt an enemy, give yourself and 11 group members minor courage, increasing your weapon and spell damage for 215. So, why do I think that Magma Incarnate is good if we're already getting that buff? Well, let's think about it like this. Let's pretend for a moment that we all have a well-organized dungeon group that we go into dungeons with, that has a healer and a tank and 2 DPS all working on what sets to run to support each other. Now let's think about, what if that healer has access to Magma Incarnate? If we run Magma Incarnate on the healer, that frees the tank up from needing to run claws. Which means that they could run something like the new set Crimson Oath's Writhe, or they could run or other buff sets like Powerful Assault, or something else. Basically, it lets the tank have other buff sets, so they don't necessarily need to be running claws. That being said, this is a slightly harder uptime to keep up than Claws of Yulnakren, and running Magma Incarnate means you don't have access to Symphony. And Symphony of Blades, which is this monster set from Depths of Malatar, is amazing on healers. This is so useful, and losing this is losing a lot of sustain on your healer. Or from your healer. Which, maybe this damage buff and this defense buff is worth, but maybe not. I think this is a good alternative to Claws, and I think that having a way to grant minor courage outside of Claws of Yulnakren is a good thing to have in the game, because, let's face it, for the most part, it is easier for the average player to get a monster set than it is to get a frickin' trial set. Because eventually, you can probably find a group that will help you get through a DLC dungeon. But I don't know that this will be meta-defining. I think it will be an option, especially in more organized groups. Or, if you're a healer main and want to go, you know what, I want to be able to make sure that we have both major and minor courage, no matter what. Which I think is a perfectly fine thing to do. But and I think this is a really cool option for healers, and maybe even for tanks, because if we look back here, we run some of these on tanks. Warden runs Polar Wind. Necromancer tanks run Spirit Tether. Sorcerers run Dark Conversion. I think this could be a very, this could also maybe be a tank set for dungeons. And I'm saying for dungeons because you only get it on 4 players total. And whereas Claws of Yulnakren gives it to up to 12. So Claws is better in a trial setting, which I think is fine, but having this as an option for group content is a very cool thing to have, and I do like that it's there. All in all, this is a good set, and I think it's a really cool extra option for tanks and healers. Moving on, let's get to the set that blows my mind the most. let's talk about Crimson Oath's Writhe, and I'm just going to open that for no reason in particular. At 2 items, it grants 1,487 armor. At 3 items, it grants 1,206 maximum health. At 4 items, it grants another stack of armor. And at 5 items, when you use an ability that applies a major or minor buff to yourself or an ally, send out a wave of energy that reduces the armor of nearby enemies within 12 meters of you by X for 15 seconds. This effect can occur once every 12 seconds and will only occur if enemies are within range. So, this is... I think they did it, guys. I think they killed Roar of Alkosh. This is a heavy armor Roar of Alkosh that is a lot easier to proc. So, assuming that even though Crimson Oath doesn't deal damage, and Roar deals damage, so, if Roar is dealing... If we are getting roughly the same output from Roar of Alkosh and Crimson Oath becomes the option if A, we don't want to go to Maw of Lorkhaj, because let's face it, who actually wants to go to Maw of Lorkhaj? And B, if we want to combine our debuff set with, say, Powerful Assault, or Olderime, or another damage buff set that we want to run on our tank. Martian Knowledge is another one. I'm not coming up with any other non-heavy ones off the top of my head. Elemental Catalyst, if your group wants you to run Elemental Catalyst on a tank. But this is a heavy armor Alkosh, which means we can get the Alkosh-like effect more consistently with less focus thrown into synergies, while having a heavy armor set, which makes wearing which pieces a lot easier. I think this is going to change up what tanks wear. I think that this set is huge for tank players, because Roar of Alkosh has been a staple in the tank game for so very long. And if Crimson Oath's Writhe can keep up, or can equal Roar of Alkosh's debuffing, I think this will kind of take over its slot, especially for earlier players, because again, it is easier to get a dungeon set than a trial set. So for a newer tank that's like, I want to get good sets to help my team, Crimson Oath's Writhe is a very easy thing to point them at normal Dreadcellar and go, let's go farm you the heavy set here. Instead of, alright, I guess our next few weeks are going to be at Maw of Lorkhaj to get stuff for Roar of Alkosh. All in all, I think, and the other really big thing that I sort of mentioned earlier is how easy these are to activate. Roar of Alkosh is notoriously hard to keep up. You have to activate a synergy every roughly 10 seconds, and synergies have a 20-second cooldown. So technically, you can do this with 2 synergies. Comfortably, you can do it with 3 synergies. So, resources from Shard/Orb, Lady Thorn, and one other synergy. Necromancers would run Avid Boneyard just to get the free synergy for Roar of Alkosh. Crimson Oath's Writhe when you use an ability that applies a major or minor buff to yourself or an ally. So for anyone who plays a tank out there, let's just think really quick. How many tanks are there that don't run some sort of skill like Frost Cloak or Ice Fortress? So, most tanks run a skill that grants them major resolve. For Warden, which is my go-to, that's Ice Fortress, because that also grants us minor protection. And grants allies within 8 meters that major resolve. For a lot of tanks, this comes from the source. This comes from Balance, which trades health for magicka and then grants you major resolve. Which means that instead of needing synergies and relying on your team, you can keep up Crimson Oath's Rive 100% of the time with frickin' ease. This is huge. This is amazing. And I think that is what's going to, assuming they're competitive, I think that's what's going to push Crimson Oath's Rive into a more focal spot. I think this is a set that's worth looking at, and I definitely think this is going to be a set that I'm going to be farming. Because, again, it's a heavy armor Alkosh that is easier to keep uptime on. And, because again, it reduces for 15 seconds for enemies in range, but it occurs once every 12 seconds. So, we chain everything in, we cast Balance, and Crimson Oath's Rive activates, and debuffs everything. That's amazing. That's really easy to keep up, and then 15 seconds later, if the fight's still going, we do that again. That's really easy. This is huge, especially for, ad pulls, because that's the main reason we still want Alkosh as much, because it helps with the underpenning ad pulls. Because you can't crush her an ad pull. I really need to, at some point, put up a video that's just talking about all of the offensive stats and what you're looking for from them on DPS. Which will also explain why this set's such a big deal. Because enemies have armor, and your penetration ignores armor, but you can only get so high, and the fact that this strips armor, the fact that this is an armor shred that very well might be competitive with the existing armor shred set, but better, is big. Also, we finally might be free of Mauve Lorcage. Frabjew's Day. Next up, we have the medium set, Rushing Agony. Remember how I said 3 of the 4 sets are probably going to be meta shakers? This is not going to be a meta shaker for PvE. Maybe PvP. So, when you deal direct damage with a Blink, Charge, Leap, Teleport, or Pull ability, pull enemies within 10 meters to you. After 2 seconds, deal X physical damage to all enemies within 7 meters. The effect can occur once every 8 seconds and scales off the higher of your weapon and spell damage. The pull will not affect crowd control immunity to a target. Will not apply crowd control immunity. So what that means is you charge in and you, the DPS, pull everything towards you. Similar to Void Bash, in how it yanks everything to you. And then after 2 seconds, you deal X physical damage to all enemies within 7 meters. So after a couple of seconds, where you rush in and yank everything to you, you explode, dealing physical damage. This effect occurs every 10 seconds and scales off the higher of your weapon and spell damage. But more importantly, that pull in does not apply crowd control immunity. And I think this sentence is the thing that redeems this set for me. So I'll admit, I'm not the biggest fan of these sets as DPS sets. I'm not really the biggest fan of them in general. Because, well, I don't know. I don't usually like them. I think they're a little bit better now that Stampede is, like, super good. But, I don't know, they always kind of felt weird to me. That said, the fact that this pulls everyone in and then 2 seconds later explodes could be really fun on something like a werewolf, where your engage is a leap that then pulls everyone in and then you do your scream and fear them, giving you a, like, somewhat decent route in a solo build. That might be something worth playing with, and that might make me actually farm Rushing Agony as, like, the second set on my werewolf, besides Sovin. That's interesting. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, that might make me want this. Oh my. And then in mortal form we run Stampede on one of our bars. And just yeet ourselves forward with that. Yeah, this might go on a werewolf build. Huh. This might be a really fun set for, like, a solo werewolf, where you just leap in, yank everyone to you, fear them, and then 2 seconds later deal physical damage to them. That's interesting, and I like that. Oh my. Okay, yeah. That's something worth considering. I think the fact that this is a pull is really, that this pulls enemies in, is good for that style of, like, solo build, because otherwise you've kind of just got to chase down enemies, which sucks. The other thing this does is that it does not apply crowd control immunity, which is the reason that that your tank is really annoyed at you for running Mad Tinkerer. Because Mad Tinkerer upsets the enemies, Mad Tinkerer and other such stuns apply crowd control immunity, which means that adds can no longer be pulled in, or rooted, or anything like that, which makes them a lot harder to control and puts more work, and puts the burden of work onto your tank even more than it already is. So I think that Rushing Agony not applying CC immunity is really good for a DPS set, and I hope they start putting this on more of these styles of sets in the future. Hopefully even retroactively, because, I mean, Mad Tinker is cool. I just really wish it didn't mess with that. And our final set, Scorians Feast. This is the light armor set from Cellar, and this is the other set that I think will really shake up the meta. At least for dungeons. This sort of fills a similar role to Magma Incarnate. So, at 2 items, 1096 maximum magicka. At 3 items, 129 magicka recovery. At 4 items, 129 weapon and spell damage. And at 5 items, when you deal damage with a fully charged heavy attack, you gain an imbued aura for 10 seconds, granting you and up to 3 other group members 307 max magicka and stamina recovery. This effect can occur once every 20 seconds. So once every 20 seconds, you throw out a heavy attack. So you get, which gives you and your group magicka and stamina recovery. And then, if you deal damage with a fully charged heavy attack with an imbued aura active, consume it, and gain overflow aura for 10 seconds, granting you and up to 3 other group members 307 weapon and spell damage. So, do the heavy attack, get the imbued armor, wait for it to almost run out, do another heavy attack, and gain overflow aura for the next 10 seconds, gaining weapon and spell damage. If you time it right, you can basically get more or less 10 seconds of of resource recovery, and then 10 seconds of damage. And then shortly after that damage tick runs out, you can refresh the imbued aura and start it over. So as long as you're heavy attacking basically once every 9 or 10 every 10 seconds-ish, you're giving your group a really big buff. And the other thing is, this is unique. So let's say we're running this alongside a group that's also giving out Major Courage, Minor Courage, and the Powerful Assault buff. That's 3 different weapon and spell damage buffs to the entire 4-man group. That's a lot of damage to push onto enemies. That's big. This might be the new dungeon meta set. Now, again, it is only 3 other group members, and you can only trigger it every 20 seconds. Because you need to trigger Imbuing Aura, and if you can't trigger Imbuing Aura, you can't trigger Overflow Aura. So, I think this is a good set. I think it's a really good, heal support set. Which is awesome. But I think it's a dungeon set, not a trial set. Which is a little bit more mixed. That said, we did get, Crimson Oath's Rive for trials. And I think Prior Theric will also show up in trials at some point. So I think this is good. And I think, I think that this will be a pretty important and pretty big set. And finally, we have some Update 30 changes. A couple of big... Most of this is PvP. Backend a bit, so they're cleaning stuff up. Little changes in bug fixes, such as improving Flame Skill's damage bonus calculation. Minor tweaks to values of Essence Drain. One of the larger changes are the reworks to the Skilled Hunter passive, Expert Hunter and its morphs, Vigil display on enemies, and Prismatic Weapons. Preferably, all 3 of these effects were consistently validating themselves, determined if your target was undead, werewolf, or vampire, with very little payoff about the extra weight. Obtain the Slayer of Evil theme for Fighters Guild, but only have it active against players to improve performance while still getting the feel-good identity they have. So this means that we lose bonus damage from our Fighters Guild abilities on non-player undead werewolves and vampires. And Prismatic Weapon has been changed so that it's a tri-resource drain. So it deals damage and then grants you magicka, stamina, and health. Which is interesting, and kind of cool. But it means we lose the giant prismatic weapon damage against bosses like Falgrim. Which might be bad. 3 new constellations to the finesse tree, to the fitness tree with all new slotted stars. Wind Chasers, Survivor's Spite, and Walking Fortress. We've also adjusted all player passives to grant hybrid versions of their stats, so things like Balanced Warrior will give weapon and spell damage plus armor, rather than weapon damage and spell resist. In addition to these, we're reworking a few older set items that had an increasingly low amount of player engagement. Sithis Touch will focus on zipping around from successful battles quickly one after another. Nikolaus will improve the ability to shrug off incoming attacks, and Crusader will receive a fitting shift to grant more appropriately to an enabling bruiser. Likely the biggest adjustment will be to an existing set is Pelennial's Aptitude, which will be changed to Pelennial's Wrath, which will now focus on the bloodlust the hero of lore comes to in their legacy life on Tamriel. Oh my. Finally, there will be some targeted buff to niche areas of the game that we feel are lacking. Two-Handed's ability to stick in melee encounters and offers comparably sustained damages in PvE, as well as the Frost Staff's ability to give the cold touch of death. Okay. This is big. I didn't read this paragraph before filming this, so this is my genuine reaction to these. So first off, new CP is interesting. I don't know what any of these do, so I can't say that I care right now. Secondly, we're adjusting player passive to give hybrid versions of these stats. So Balanced Warrior will now give weapon and spell damage plus armor, rather than weapon damage and spell resist. Okay, how far are you going in this? Because if this is changing fully, this might shake up the meta more than I was expecting this patch to. So they're clearly trying to encourage more divided play, more, generic play, which is something that we also noticed in these. Like, this is a physical damage set. Up until this patch, this would have just been 129 weapon damage. Same goes for Grizzly Gourmet's weapon and spell damage and offensive penetration. These would have been weapon damage and physical penetration in previous sets. And same honestly goes for the rest of these. Like, weapon and spell damage, offensive penetration. Weapon and spell damage. Up until now, those would have been one or the other. That is awesome! This gives more room for weird and interesting, mixed builds. And it also might bring things like Nightblade and Dragon Knights, some of their passives more into view, because let's go all out on our dreams of what this means. And and we're looking at adjusting all player passives to grant hybrid versions of their stats. So let's start here. And let's start here. We're going to start by looking at this. When you cast an Earth and Heart ability, you and your group gain minor brutality for 20 seconds, increasing your weapon damage by 10%. If you are in combat, you also generate 3 ultimate. First off, that's already kinda good, especially on, a Dragon Knight tank, where you're casting Igneous Shield a ton. This skill gets cast so much on tanks. But you're granting minor brutality, which is a weapon damage buff. And similarly on Nightblade, we have the passive Hemorrhage. Increase your critical damage by 10%. Dealing critical damage grants minor savagery, increasing your weapon critical rating by 1,314. There's a similar buff in Sorcerer and Templar to give sorcery and prophecy. Templar has a way to give sorcery, and Sorcerer has a way to give prophecy. If this sort of change means that they're giving both of those both sides, that changes so much. Because that allows so much more freedom for people to play what class they want. You no longer have we need someone to be playing a sorcerer, because as long as someone's playing a Nightblade in that group, you're getting the sorcerer buff anyways. And you don't need someone to play you don't necessarily need someone playing a Templar for the buff, because if someone's playing a Dragon Knight, they can keep that buff up anyways. If that's how far it goes, that's huge. However, if it's just things like Balanced Warrior giving that, or say that Warden passive in Winter's Embrace, if it's stuff like Piercing Cold giving a bonus, instead of bonus magic and frost, if it's stuff like this giving physical damage as well of some kind, maybe bleed, because Stam Warden's got some decent, like, bleed-leaning things in its skill list. Here in Animal Companions. Like, this is a bleed... Like, this is one of the few bleed skills in the game. I wouldn't be surprised if Deep Fissure gets changed... Or, not Deep Fissure. Subterranean Assault gets changed to a bleed. As well. But I could see that being the extent they go with it, and try and not take away from certain classes shining, so that we only need half the classes that we can ignore Templar and Sorcerer as much. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but I don't necessarily think they should do that. But this gets me excited for that sort of thing, because I love anything that opens up more variety in this game. The other thing here is that they're reworking some of these old sets. So let's pull these up. We have Sithis Touch, Nikolaos, and Crusader are being name dropped. So let's remember what these do. Sithis Touch. I don't remember how this is spelled. Nikulas. And Crusader and Pelenel. Okay. So let's start with Sithis Touch. Currently, maximum health, crit chance. When you use the Blade of Woe, you gain Major Berserk for 20 seconds, increasing your damage done by 10%. Blade of Woe is the big problem here, because we're putting a 5-piece set into something that is hard to get off. It's also worth noting that this is a heavy, light, or medium armor set, so you could run this in any weight on any build. And it's an overland, so it's probably not going to be that hard to get. We don't know what they're changing it to, but it's apparently focused on zipping around from successful battles quickly one after the other. So maybe it'll be something similar to how False Gods works right now, giving major... Maybe, like... I think my dream would be after... When you exit combat... I think how I would do that, based on that description, is when you exit combat... gain major and minor expedition. So, like, you exit combat and you just zip off in the other direction. Fast as lightning. That would be actually really cool. And that might make it, like, worth picking up. Nikolaos will improve the ability to shrug off incoming attacks. So Nikolaos right now, armor, max health. When you block a spell projectile, you have a 20% chance to reflect it. That's terrible. Like, that's really bad. Especially since we have skills that do this already. Why would I waste a 5-piece on that when I can slot defensive barrier, defensive posture, or I think spell barrier is the other morph that does this. Why would I ever spend the time on Nikolaos? Well, if they're making this so that you can shrug off heavier attacks, there might be a niche for Nikolaos. And Crusader will receive a fitting shift to grant something more appropriate of an enabling bruiser. Crusader currently increases the duration of the dodge chance bonus of roll dodge by 0.3 seconds. So Crusader makes your roll dodges better as a 5-piece set. That's mediocre to bad. Like, I don't even know. I don't even know what to say about this set. But the fact that all 3 of these are getting changed because they're really not getting any player attention, I think that that's awesome. And I am happy that they're doing this. And I am probably going to run around in at least 2 of these sets once they're changed, just to show how much I appreciate this change. They're also apparently changing Perennial's Aptitude to Perennial's Wrath. So Perennial's Aptitude is max health, stamina recovery, magicka recovery, and your spell and weapon damage both become the higher of the 2 variables. So this is a hybrid focus set. It's a 9-piece crafted set found on the Gold Coast. It's cool, and it's definitely fun for hybrids. I think that the change to this will prove interesting, and I think that there is a very real possibility that Perennial's Wrath will just be another interesting and cool crafted set. And clearly, if Diamond's Victory is anything to go by, they don't give a crap what they make crafted sets anymore, because none of that matters. It's just gotta be cool. And finally, there are some targeted buffs in a couple of niches. Two-Hander's ability to stick in melee and offer comparable sustained damage in PvE. Okay, so these are a couple of things that are interesting to me. So, first off, the two-handed skill line kind of lags behind a bit behind dual wield for raw damage output. And part of that is their passives, because Forceful is a little gimmicky, as is Follow-Up. And Battle Rush isn't a great capstone. Heavy Weapons is good, because Heavy Weapons is basically Twin Blade and Blunt. Except they don't have the dagger, so you lose a little bit on that. But all in all, it's got a pretty good set of skills. You've got, like, Wrecking Blow, you've got Stampede as a dot. Why did I open Wrecking Blow? You've got Wrecking Blow, you've got Stampede, you've got Brawler for some cleave. Cleave. You've got Reverse Slash and Reverse Slice and Executioner for these really good executes. Momentum's pretty good as just like a Karkyu, I'm not dying, and also a free source of Major Brutality, just to make sure you can get that on your stamina character. But I do think that two-handed has been lagging behind, and also this ultimate. I mean, admittedly, the dual wield ultimate also kind of sucks, but it'd be nice to have a cool like horde clear ultimate for a stamina character, because there's a lot less of one right now. And the other thing is Froststaff's ability to give the touch of cold death. This makes me think that Frostbite was step 1. So I talked about this a little bit in my Frostbite video, but currently ice damage is kind of low. Like, you can do some decent damage with ice builds. I have an ice build that deals some pretty decent damage. But all in all, ice damage lags behind. And part of that is how they're themed. Fire is increased damage. Thunder is better AoE, and ice is defense. So, for example, Blockade of Frost is more expensive, but grants damage shield and immobilizes chill. Unstable Wall of Storms sets concussed enemies off balance. Unstable Wall of Fire deals more damage to burning enemies. Clench knocks enemies back, Frost Clench immobilizes and taunts, and Shock Clench converts it into an AoE explosion. Frost Ring provides minor protection, Shock Ring's damage increases based on the number of enemies hits, and Fire Ring deals more damage based off their missing health. One of these things is worse than the others, at least for a DPS. And, like, the passives also reflect this. Ice Staff heavy attacks grant a shield. Inferno heavy attacks deal more damage. Lightning heavy attacks damage nearby enemies. Inferno Staff increases single target damage. Lightning Staff increases AoE damage. Ice Staff reduces block cost, increases the amount of damage you can block. When he absorbs damage with the Destruction Staff damage shield, you restore Magicka. That's more because of how they changed Ice Staffs in, I want to say Greymore? But all in all, if they're making Frost damage viable, then that could push, and especially if they're going all out on making Frost damage viable, by playing with some of these. So, I have been wanting, and I'm not the only one, I have been wanting, the Animal Companion's skills to line up more with the flavor. Because magic damage is boring. And I'm just gonna come out and say it. Magic damage is boring compared to the idea that Screaming Cliff Racer and Deep Fissure could be dealing cold damage instead, and fit into Warden's theme of I am an ice mage, and play into that feel of frost damage and ice magic and all of that cool stuff. Also, possibly, like, removing Frozen Retreat and replacing this with, like, a frost damage glyph. Similar to the Mages Guild fire glyph. That would be cool. That would really change how Warden plays, and it would help reinforce that class identity, which, unfortunately, most classes don't have that. Give me sorcerers dealing who can build full lightning damage. Give me wardens that can deal full frost that are mostly frost damage. I want that. Okay, keep an eye out in patch notes for some juicy buffs to 2 specific abilities. So this line makes me think they're not going to go as far as I want for that. But I think that that's going to change. I think that's specifically going to change Impulse. And I think that's going to change Force Shock. Because this is the spammable. And this is the AoE that people are going to think about. I'm expecting this to be replaced with a some sort of damage effect. And I'm expecting this to now specifically deal one element type. And maybe that's silly. And maybe I'm completely wrong. Or maybe they're changing how Impulse works, and then changing how Wrecking Blow works, or Uppercut works. And maybe not. I don't know. I don't know what they're planning to change. We'll have to see what comes out when the PTS cycle arrives. But that is, I believe, everything that we have to talk about. So, thank you to everyone for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this rambling video. And we will see you next time for more like this. Maybe. Well, when the patch notes comes out, there'll be more like this. Otherwise, we'll be back to more Left of Meta videos. Until then, good luck, stay safe, and don't die.